Okay, it's just 9:01 by our local clocks, 1 minute past 8 a.m. Universal Coordinated Time. My name is Kevin Ashley. I'm the Director of the Digital Curation Centre at the University of Edinburgh and also Chair of the Programme Committee for Plenary 17. Welcome virtually to Edinburgh. And before we get on to the main business of the day, we're going to have a short musical interlude from the Nevis Ceilidh Band. So take it away, Alex and the Nevis Ceilidh Band.
Hello and welcome to the RDA Plenary 17. We are Nevis Ceilidh Band and we would like to welcome you warmly to Scotland. We're going to kick off with a little reel and then we'll be starting the dancing with a Gay Gordons.
So thanks very much there to the Nevis Ceilidh Band and welcome to all of you. You can see so many people joining us from many corners of the world there. So thanks to the Nevis Ceilidh Band. If you want to hear a little bit more of them or even why not join the social session that's taking place on Thursday at 14:15 UTC. So on behalf of my colleagues at the DCC, the University of Edinburgh, and our co-hosts at UK Research and Innovation and JISC, welcome to RDA's 17th plenary. It's a very different event to the one we imagined over 2 years ago when planning began, but one that we already know from some of the co-located events that took place yesterday has been going really positively for many of you. Now, shortly I'm going to introduce you to our opening speakers, but first, just a few practical hints for those of you who've not yet had a chance perhaps to try out this platform. So chairs, speakers, attendees hopefully should already have received instructions appropriate to what you're doing. And if you haven't, there are training rooms available to test out your screen sharing, etc. On the homepage. And in case of difficulty, there's the online chat bot and help desk available to you. There are two session types, the main stage and the breakout. Most are breakouts, including the coffee and lunch breaks. This, with the main stage function, functions slightly differently. You need to use the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen to raise questions for the speaker. In breakouts, you should keep your camera and microphone off whilst others are presenting. And that chat and the Q&A is clearly visible to all in the Q&A function. You can vote questions up and down. We'll use those to decide what to give to the speaker. In case of doubt, the hashtag is RDA plenary, accept no substitutes. A reminder also that RDA has a code of conduct that's available from the RDA website, and as in all RDA events and interactions, we expect everyone to abide by that. But now it's my pleasure to welcome RDA's Secretary General, Hilary Hanaho, to give her words of introduction to RDA. Thank you, Hilary.
Thank you, Gavin. So hello, and a very warm welcome also from me to the Research Data Alliance's 17th plenary meeting. As you know, of course, virtually taking place in Edinburgh. with over 785 attendees from 37 countries across the globe. And I see in the chat, which is wonderful, that there are many people telling us where they're from, so please continue to do that. This week sees over 120 different events and meetings between the RDA plenary itself and all the co-located events. And my colleagues have totted up something over 1,000 people will be joining us on the platform this week. I'd like to start by thanking our local hosts from the bottom of my heart. The Digital Curation Centre, the UK Research and Innovation and JISC, and all the many, many people behind this week of events. In September 2018, Kevin Ashley submitted an application to host an RDA plenary meeting on behalf of this consortium. None of us, especially Kevin and his team, would have imagined that we would not all be together in Edinburgh, savouring the Scottish weather, the RDA community atmosphere, the wonderful sites that Edinburgh and surroundings had to offer, and progressing the fundamental work of the Research Data Alliance community. Effectively, Kevin and his team have organised this event 3 times. They have invested resources to plan a physical plenary, then a hybrid one, and now finally a fully virtual one. Only they can understand the huge effort, resources and emotion that have been invested to date. However, they have done a fantastic job of ensuring that we get as much Scottish atmosphere and networking, as you just saw, and opportunities during the breaks. So please navigate, not now or you might leave the room, the programme and the features to add the events and meetings to your calendars, to contact other participants through the attendees list. And remember, points make prizes. The more you interact over the week, the higher your standings in the polls. A very big thank you to our sponsors, Gale, Libnova and Springer Nature, for their support. Events are costly, especially 3 of them, and sponsors are valuable and highly appreciated. The theme chosen by our local hosts for this plenary is Opening Data for Global Challenges. That epitomises RDA and the community. That's another way of stating our vision, that researchers and innovators are openly sharing and reusing data across technologies, across disciplines, and across countries to address the grand challenges of society. It is the organisation's core business. RDA, the community, you, build the social and technical bridges to achieve that vision. RDA celebrated its 5th birthday in March 2018. Now it has passed an 8-year milestone. We now have over 11,500 individual members. That's 5,000 more than its 5th birthday. We have over 60 organisational and affiliate members. That's 20 more than its 5th birthday. We have 50 outputs and recommendations, more than double since its 5th birthday. And we still have 100 active working and interest groups. We have recently launched a new category of communities of practice, which we hope to see starting over the next few months, and there will be some introductions to it during the breakout sessions this week. Last year, we witnessed the power of the RDA community in its rapid response to the COVID-19 call for action. And we continue to witness the value and the impact that RDA has across the globe as an open, inclusive, dynamic and innovative community. We have strengthened our collaboration with our global partner organisations through the Data Together, with whom we work very closely with CoData, the World Data System and GoFair. Growth is important. Growth means we're expanding and truly achieving our goals of being open, of being inclusive, of being global. Being global also means recognising linguistic diversity. And while our common working language in RDA is English, we have seen an increase in multilingual content over the last few years. Yesterday, RDA France organised the RDA for Newcomers in French. The very useful plenary pathway navigation tool has been translated into Spanish. And there are many national groups working to spread the word about the community's outputs to their local stakeholders in their own language. all volunteer effort by the RDA community. Last year, the Council worked on the organisation's strategic plan for 2020 to 2023, which was, in true RDA style, consulted with all the governance boards and the community. We gathered the feedback and published the plan early this year. The RDA Secretariat has worked on the implementation priorities for 2021, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that tomorrow during the business outputs and adoption session. I'd like to highlight the fact that all of our governance boards are volunteer. At the last plenary meeting in Costa Rica, we opened the Technical Advisory Board elections, and we have 5 new members on tab, joining the other 10 members. They work very, very hard to provide fundamental technical insight through reviewing new groups, supporting existing groups, generating the complex plenary schedule. And then we have the Organisational Assembly, which is made up of delegates from our organisational and affiliate members. They elect an Organisational Advisory Board who provide essential insight from an organisational perspective for RDA. The RDA Council, who provide strategic and financial oversight of the organisation, 9 individuals from different parts of the globe who invest significant time and effort with delegates from the other boards. Please note, by the way, that the elections for the next 3-year term for 3 council members are opening today. So please exercise your RDA member voting rights. The next governance board to be launched very soon is the Regional Advisory Board, made up of representatives of the funding regions of RDA, Australia, Europe, France, and the United States, together with the Regional Assembly, which is a forum for the regions that are planning to support RDA. Regional support is the bread and butter of RDA. It is fundamental for the financial support of the organisation. Not only does it make an important connection between the global community and the local one, but it is also the mechanism through which we support the community in our daily operations. All but 1 staff member of the 6-woman-strong secretariat are provided through in-kind staff support from the regional organisations. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those volunteers from all of our boards for making RDA what it is today. So there are many technical, social, and organisational achievements by this amazing community-driven organisation, and we should all be very proud. This success brings with a series of challenges for the future, the most critical being financial sustainability. We have set up a task force to work on what the future of RDA looks like. As with all of the activities that impact the organisation and the community, we will continuously inform you and the boards on the progress, on the proposals, and work together, I hope, to identify a stable future for this wonderful community. Please join or listen to the recording, if it's not in your time zone, to the business outputs and adoption session tomorrow to hear more, and also watch out for the surveys, the updates, and the webinars over the coming months. This is crucial. It determines the future of this organisation that is made up by each and every one of you. In March 2018, that was my first plenary meeting as the Secretary General, I used a metaphor for the Research Data Alliance. I likened it to an orchestra. I've been thinking about these 3 years recently, and I have this great honour of representing a global community of data professionals, an international cohort of volunteers, and I'd like to remind you of that metaphor once again. The Research Data Alliance is a unique organisation. There is no other global organisation that conducts all of its work openly and inclusively. There is no other global organisation that makes all of its outputs available to the world. There is no other organisation that encompasses all technologies, all disciplines, and all countries. You are RDA. I think of you, the community, as a very large group of musicians, and your instruments are your skills, experience, and knowledge that you bring to the RDA Research Data Orchestra. You are a collective group of instrumentalists who each bring their unique individual music and sound to the table, or the concert, if you like. The analogy with an orchestra is a fitting one because it is so in tune, if you pardon the pun, with RDA's guiding principles, our core values. The sound and melody requires balance and inclusivity. We need different musicians and instruments to perform our concerts, different skills, different experiences, different cultures, different genders. We need harmony across all the different instruments and sounds. We need consensus to play together, to allow all to be heard, to offer each and every musician and instrument its correct space and visibility in the orchestra. Our orchestra is open to everyone with a skill and a knowledge they wish to share. We welcome new instruments, new musicians, and invite all to join our recitals. Our recitals, our rehearsals, our concerts are non-profit and they're open to all. We are driven by the members of the orchestra, or in RDA terms, the community. So while this research data orchestra is hugely diverse, we all share one common vision, that researchers and innovators openly share and reuse data across technologies, across disciplines, and across countries to address the grand challenges of society. It is a truly wonderful orchestra, this one. It has so much potential, and it plays wonderful music on an international stage. There are always challenges on the horizon. It wouldn't be real if there weren't. But I know that playing this wonderful music to the world as a collective group of passionate, driven believers, we can overcome these challenges. So thank you for being part of this orchestra. Thank you for your individual contributions that make up this fantastic ensemble. We welcome each and every one. Thank you very, very much. And I wish you a wonderful plenary meeting.
Thanks very much, Hilary. And indeed, thanks for that inspiring metaphor. We may not have an orchestra up here on the stage, but we have perhaps a virtual chamber group here. And I'd like to invite to those representing our hosts at the University of Edinburgh, Gavin McLachlan, Chief Information Officer and Librarian of the University of Edinburgh.
Well, thanks, Kevin. Thanks very much. Everyone, I'd just like to welcome everyone to this wondrous conference. I'd like to extend a huge welcome from the University of Edinburgh. I wish I could have welcomed you all to our beautiful city, but alas, travel is still very restricted. And I'm very proud that we've been able to still go ahead with the conference, of course, virtually from many areas of the world. So again, welcome everyone. Clearly, the COVID period has been incredibly difficult for us. But what COVID has taught us is the absolute critical nature of sharing research information and research data. Open data was a huge success and continues to be a huge success during the COVID period. An unparalleled and unprecedented amount of sharing that shows just how fast knowledge and discovery can happen. One example is the EVE-2 study. That is the data held in the National Safe Haven of Public Health for Scotland that provides a complete cohort study of 5.4 million people in Scotland, 99% of the population. That data has now been used many times over for some fascinating studies. One of the studies that came out of it was by the Usher Institute here at the University of Edinburgh, where they conclusively proved the efficacy of the vaccines, particularly the Pfizer and the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. This has helped not just our country, but many countries to understand and plan their vaccine rollouts, and also make sure that the public are aware of the risks, but also the huge, huge benefits of the vaccines. Another key element that has come out of the COVID period is the increased element of public trust, interest, ability, and even demand for data. Can you imagine a time where millions of members of the public would look at trending data on COVID cases, discuss the R number, I mean, how many people even knew what that was before COVID? And pore over data about efficacy of the virus and various prevention techniques. We have truly entered a new age of data and the ability and demand for the public themselves to get access and understand for themselves. With recent activities such as Coalition S of the European research funders, and particularly the recent launch of the Open Research Europe publishing platform by the European Commission, clearly the time of open research and data has arrived. In particular, the Open Research Europe publishing platform is a fantastic and very large-scale example of some of the changes that are dramatically happening in our area. That platform allows not just the research articles, but links to the citations and all supporting data materials, including reanalysis for replication and reuse. It makes the research results as well as the data fully openly accessible, freely available both to researchers and to citizens. And furthermore, that platform has now turned the research articles themselves into data by allowing them all to be mineable. A fantastic result, which I think we will see many, many new aspects in the future. So why did the University of Edinburgh choose to host this conference? Edinburgh itself has a long history of open data and open research. Obviously, the Digital Creation Centre itself, the work of our library, the Software Sustainable Institute, and also the City Deal, one of the largest deals struck between a university in the UK and the governments. What the governments have now given to the University of Edinburgh is a mandate to go ahead and make Edinburgh into one of the data center capitals of Europe. The growth of not just research data, but the entire data economy is a key element affecting our strategy and our thinking. Finally, I'd like to thank the three partners, the STFC, JISC, and the Digital Creation Centre, and of course the Research Data Alliance itself for holding this conference. And I'd like to give particular thanks to two individuals, Kevin Ashley, who you've met, and Alex Della Pelta, both of the Digital Creation Centre, for putting on this wonderful conference. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin. And now to hand over to our representative from UK Research and Information, Rachel Bruce, Head of Open Research with UKRI.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm pleased to be able to add my welcome to delegates to this Research Data Alliance plenary meeting. And indeed, as Gavin and Kevin and Hilary have said, we didn't expect it to be like this, but I want to also just start with a big thank you to the organising team, and in particular, Alex, who has worked extremely hard to be able to put this event on. So for those that don't know what UK Research and Innovation is, we are the largest public research funder in the UK, and we comprise the 7 research councils that cover different disciplinary areas, and also a body called Innovate UK, which works with academia and industry to drive new innovations, and also a body called Research England, which funds the core funding of English universities within the UK and works with the devolved funders on the Research Excellence Framework. The aims of the Research Data Alliance and the work that you all do is absolutely crucial in improving research and innovation. And of course, that in turn helps to establish our research objectives from the UK Research and Innovation. And so working with organisations like the RDA are absolutely essential in making our long-held policy objectives a reality, So back in 2011, all of the UK research councils developed research data policy objectives, which were really about making data sharing and management of data part of research in a routine way across all disciplines. And we have been engaged with the Research Data Alliance since its foundation in 2013, and it's been absolutely critical, as I say, in terms of building and on those policy objectives and making them a reality. In terms of activities, current activities, our recent infrastructure roadmap identified the necessity of connected and interconnected large-scale data, and that being an absolutely critical thread running through all disciplines. Currently, within UKRI, we're supporting many different investments in terms of the development of data skills. And in particular, there's an initiative around life science data. And one particular output from there is actually based in the University of Edinburgh. So a collaboration funded by our Medical Research Council with the Human Genetics Unit at Edinburgh University. Similarly to words that Gavin said, obviously the pandemic has showed us how absolutely essential data sharing, data management and reuse is. We signed up to the rapid research data sharing principles early on in the pandemic that were hosted by the Wellcome Trust. And ensured that all of the terms and conditions on the COVID research that we funded abided by those principles. And we're now working to try and learn lessons with other partners across the globe in terms of how research has been undertaken and the results that have come from that and how to build that into research as we move forward. I'd just like to also mention our new digital research infrastructure 5-year plan, which again includes research data at its very heart and the need to develop skills and fair data infrastructure, including compute, data analysis platforms. And as part of that, of course, working globally is absolutely critical. And your efforts here in the Research Data Alliance are absolutely essential to that. Indeed, it's through organisations like this that our research that we fund helps meet our goals and mission of economic and social benefits. So thank you very much all and enjoy yourselves, and I'm sure the meeting will be very productive. So thank you again.
And thanks very much, Rachel. And finally, it's my pleasure to welcome the last representative, our co-host, Liam Ernie, the Executive Director of Digital Resources at JISC.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, everybody. On behalf of JISC, I'd like to thank you all for joining this year's virtual plenary in Edinburgh. It is our pleasure to support this event and to see such fantastic turnout, though a level of turnout that one would expect given the increasingly widespread acknowledgement of the need to actively engage with the management of research data. We hope that you'll take the opportunity to visit the JISC booth over the next few days, and if you'd like to discuss any areas of our work, our colleagues look forward to speaking with you. As colleagues have said, given the year that's just passed, the focus of the plenary on the themes of global challenges, global mechanisms for data reuse, sustainable solutions and global cooperation seems particularly apposite. And even if right now in the UK, we're starting to feel more optimistic, the continuing challenges and struggles that we see elsewhere make us all the more aware of our interdependence with others, and that there is no UK solution to the challenges posed by COVID-19 that does not also encompass a global response, and that science and research will be central to overcoming those challenges. JISC has been fortunate to be able to play a role in the scientific response to the pandemic, which has highlighted the importance of infrastructure to the effective management of research data. As part of our COVID-19 response, the JANET network enabled the transfer of a 5 terabit COVID-related data set between the European Bioinformatics Institute and Imperial College London in less than 3 hours at a data rate of around 500 megabits per second. That testifies to just some of the challenges associated with the ever-growing volume of research data generated by research. Never before has doing research been so dependent on infrastructure to support the management of research data, on the capacity of network security, connectivity, and access management. But GIST's work with research data goes beyond the capacity and security of the network, crucial as it is. GIST has a long history of working with the community to support the management of research data and encourage the practice of open research. We've recently launched a number of services, including our research data repository, which is compliant with the mandatory requirements of Plan S, which Gavin mentioned earlier, and includes an inbuilt fair checker to make sure research data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Alongside this, we now see increasing levels of interest in our preservation services from across institutions and continue to actively support the adoption and utilization of persistent identifiers. And we remain committed to data sharing and openness as approaches that need to be considered throughout the whole research life cycle and not just when the outputs are produced. Just as the RDA builds the social and technical bridges to enable the open sharing and reuse of data, our new research and innovation sector strategy lays out our priorities for how we will support the technical and social infrastructure for the management and sharing of ever-increasing volumes of data produced by research. Finally, although UK-focused, GISC's work has an impact internationally, and the RDA is an important link to that international community. We're proud of the variety of ways we support international engagement through EOSC, Open Air, and as part of the UK Data Service, making data available for impactful teaching, research, and policy making. So once again, thank you all for joining this plenary. Enjoy the plenary, and we look forward to speaking with you in the days ahead.
And indeed, thanks very much, Liam. Apologies, there's slightly slow reaction on my buttons there. And I think, as each of our speakers then has made clear, as hosts, we support Research Data Alliance and its aims because it helps each of us in our organisations achieve so much more than we could do alone, working together with colleagues from around the world. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. Jenny Tennyson is Vice President and Chief Strategy Advisor of the Open Data Institute, an organisation we've taken keen interest throughout the years in bridging that gap between open data in the public context and open data in research. So I'm delighted to hand over to you, Jenny. Remember, you can raise questions in the Q&A column at the right. If time's available, we'll take some questions at the end of your talk. Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Thank you for the introduction. I just want to check that people can hear me. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen now, so hopefully this works. And here we go. Right. So thanks so much for inviting me to speak today about the important work that you guys are doing, but also to try and set some of the work of the Research Data Alliance in the context of the wider data ecosystem. So thinking about how data, particularly research data, is being used beyond the research field, and therefore what some of the things that we should, and you should as a research data community, be thinking about. For those that you don't know me and know the ODI, I'm Vice President and Chief Strategy Advisor at the Open Data Institute. I'm also co-chair of the Data Governance Working Group of the Global Partnership for AI, which is quite a mouthful to say. The ODI is a not-for-profit that's based in the UK, and our vision is a world where data works for everyone, and we particularly focus on working with companies and governments to build an open and trustworthy data ecosystem. What we believe at ODI is that getting positive impact from data means influencing decisions that are made by many different people and organisations, policymakers, business leaders, us individually, day to day in our lives, that's only possible when people create tools and insights that help inform those decision makers. And that's only possible when there are organisations stewarding and sharing data that can be used in order to inform those tools and those decisions. So this is our very, very simplistic kind of data value chain that we'll come back to during this talk. What I'm going to talk about today is three things. So first of all, the demands of data-driven decision-making and some of the implications that the new emphasis on using data to make decisions, particularly at a policy level, might have on how we think about, in particular, research and research data. I'm then going to talk about the realities of reusing research data and some of the issues and constraints and some of the ways in which we've been investigating at ODI, the role of institutions in supporting that. And then you can see that I was getting carried away with my alliteration here, the virtues of a Verdant vision, something about the way in which the world is changing and what that means for those of us who are practitioners in terms of holding on to a vision of the world that we want to create through the use of data. So first of all, the demands of data-driven decision-making, and a lot of this will pick up on the themes that have already been touched on. When we think about the way that research is used in this very simple value chain that I put up earlier, one way is that researchers are the creators of analyses that then inform decision makers. So they sit in that kind of create box, creating insights and analysis that then helps to inform policymakers and other people to make decisions. And that's how we get impact from, that's a crucial step in getting impact from data that we have. And I want to talk about three trends that we've seen in particular over the last year, but also last few years. First of all, a trend towards evidence-based policy making. So an increasing thrust towards policymakers using data and evidence to inform their actions, or at least saying that they're doing so. I think it's worth being a little bit skeptical about some of those claims and looking at where data is useful to be used in informing policy and where it isn't, where values and fine judgments about the right way forward need to be applied. We can provide data and research about the effectiveness of different kinds of interventions around COVID-19. We can't make the subtle judgments that there are around the cost of people's lives versus economic costs, for example. But there is a push towards using data, or at least showing that you're using data in making those kinds of decisions. Second is a growth in the availability of alternative data sources. So data that comes out of our interactions with the digital world day to day. And in particular, we've seen this during the COVID crisis in the use of, for example, Facebook data, data from Google, data from Apple, that demonstrate mobility patterns and the degree to which people are adhering to kind of lockdown rules. And we have to, again, recognize that these are incredibly important and useful new alternative data sources, but they also have challenges associated with them. Often the people who, about whom the data is collected don't necessarily know that that was a use that that data might be put to. And they can exclude particular portions of the public because they, for example, don't use Facebook or Google or Apple, don't have a smartphone. So they are useful, but have limits as well. And the final trend I just wanted to highlight was around public distrust of data use. I think during the COVID pandemic, we've obviously, as the other speakers have talked about, seen more people get engaged with data and the figures around data. But we've also seen over the last several years a rise in distrust around the way that data is used. Films like The Social Dilemma and other popular films on Netflix and elsewhere kind of, to me, highlight what the growing public narrative is around the use of data, which is primarily a narrative about exploitation rather than empowerment. And I think that lapsing into a narrative that says that because of COVID, we all now see the value of data, I think is really ignoring this growing narrative that is about public distrust of data use, something that we should be aware of. So what does this mean? What do these different trends kind of imply? Well, first of all, I think that we should be looking much more closely at engagement mechanisms that get us in touch with the people who are either providing data or are affected by the use of data, even through research and as well as through kind of policy making. For me, ethics boards are no longer enough. We need to be looking for more participative models that bring people on the journey of acceptance about the use of data. And we need to listen to what they say about what isn't acceptable right now, currently, in terms of norms of use of that data. This is a pointer to a very good public deliberation that was carried out by One London around the use of health and care data in London. And I think we need to get better at these kinds of mechanisms. We need to learn how to do these well and efficiently. Second is that closed and proprietary data and code fuels mistrust. When we can't see the data that is being used to inform decisions, and when we can't see the models that are using that data to create outputs, then it is very easy for that vacuum of information to be filled by misinformation, conspiracy theories, distrust around the use of data. And this, for me, is one of the reasons why openness is so important. It's not only about helping research to advance, it's also about, again, taking people on the journey of understanding the basis for the decisions that are being made. So open data and code is a way of building trust, not just advancing research better. Another observation from the past year is the real role of media and other third parties in taking data and information and representing it in ways that help people to grasp it and to understand it. And we should be exploiting those third parties to make the information that we provide much more palatable for a range of different audiences, because we can't suit everybody with the way in which we communicate data. But by having a range of different people presenting information in different ways, then we can. And my final kind of observation is that we have to recognize the complex role that data and knowledge play particularly in policy making. This is a diagram from a paper called Knowledge Exchange Processes in Organizations and Policy Arenas, which pulls together some of the analysis about how knowledge and information actually gets used when it comes to decision making. And it really highlights how, particularly in highly polarized circumstances, then there's a very much this kind of picking and choosing of what information gets surfaced and actually gets used in making decisions. And it's only in the places where there's already consensus that we're able to use knowledge and data really well. And it's worth bearing that in mind about the way in which data can be misused or misinterpreted or used for political kind of purposes as we produce our research. So the rounded point that I wanted to make from this section is just how important communication is, good data communication is, when getting the most out of data. And that has several aspects to it. First, I think this point about needing to explain how data is being governed and how it's being done well, describing the sources of data, privacy protections, the ethical processes, the participation that is involved in creating data and in using data, is essential for preventing there being a backlash against the use of data, including in research. Second is avoiding simplistic narratives arising out of data. We need to protect our use of data by recognizing limitations and blind spots, identifying where supplementary information is needed for a fuller picture, especially as we use more alternative data sources, being much more explicit about those and in ways that people who are interpreting data can understand, interpreting your analyses can understand, I think is essential. And the final point is that particularly as we enter this evidence-based policy making realm, we also have to enable alternative narratives, support reinterpretation of data, support reanalysis, representation, combination of data with different sources that give a fuller picture, that provide alternative ways of thinking about what data is telling us. Because any one data set or any one analysis can only tell us part of the truth, and it's through this dialogue, through the scientific process, that we get to having a much fuller and more realistic picture of what's going on. So the second area that I wanted to talk about was about the realities of reusing research data. So here I'm talking more about how data that is generated from research then gets reused by the rest of the data ecosystem. We've seen this, obviously, the importance of research data reuse through the COVID-19 pandemic, and how open research data has supported better and faster and more collaborative research internationally. For me, then, this is one of the fantastic outcomes of the pandemic, and something that if this pandemic had happened at another time, we would not have been in such a good place, because we wouldn't have had this infrastructure that enabled us to communicate and to share data so quickly and easily. But we also have to recognize that research data is important outside of research. So at the ODI, then, we look at data sharing not only from research and academia, but also from governments, from private sector organizations, from civil society, and from the people that kind of exist in the middle of those different kinds of sectors. And it's not only data sharing from them, it's data reuse by them. So research data is and can and does get used by the public sector, but also the private sector in making business decisions, also in civil society in helping them to support others. And recognizing this broader reuse means a different kind of support is needed, I think, around our data infrastructures. Because using research data outside of a research context can be really problematic. Obviously, it can surprise participants. People who have donated data for research purposes might not be so happy when that data is being reused by, say, private sector organizations in order to turn a profit. The permissions that people give around the collection and reuse of data are very context and purpose dependent, and changing that purpose can be problematic and surprise them and cause a backlash. It can obviously be inappropriate. Not all research studies are necessarily constrained, and a good research recognizes its limitations. But sometimes when data is reused, those limitations might not be fully understood or might not be fully applied. So it is easy to take data that is generated in one context and try to apply it in another when it might be inappropriate. And the third thing, and one that I'm going to go into in a little bit more detail, is that it can be unreliable. Data use by the public sector, private sector, by civil society and by others often requires an ongoing use, an operational use. And so creating data just for a single study and trying to reuse that data many years down the line isn't going to work. Taxonomies that get created as part of a single project then go unmaintained as our conception of that domain changes are problematic, because they don't get to change and mutate over time. And in extreme cases, we do find that data that is created through individual projects can disappear when people move off or go elsewhere. And so this means that our data infrastructure that we rely on is undermined. And this is the point that I really want to make, that data is a new form of infrastructure. I'm not talking about the kind of physical infrastructure that we've already touched on, the digital infrastructure that supports data, so things like servers and broadband and so forth. I'm talking about data itself. The data assets that we have are themselves a new form of infrastructure, something that we as a society now rely on. And the data that is produced as part of research is part of that broader data infrastructure, both nationally and internationally. And thinking of data as infrastructure makes us think more about how we make it available and accessible, and enable it to change and update over the longer term, how we steward it well. That's what's led a lot of the research that we've been doing at ODI into this area of data institutions. Data institutions are organizations whose purpose involves stewarding data on behalf of others in order to create economic and social value. And there are a number of different kinds of patterns that we've seen about the kind of roles that data institutions take. Sometimes they hold data on behalf of an organization or a person or a group of organizations or people, and then share it with some of those who want to use it. So kind of research hubs are a common example of those kinds of places where data is pulled together and then shared out. Sometimes data institutions combine or link data, so provide additional kind of value-added services over the top of data, provide insights and services back to those that contributed it. There's a particular one that we highlight called HILO, which brings in data about shipping to a central place, shipping accidents, and then shares back insights to the owners of shipping companies about where there are patterns in accidents that help them improve, help them to benchmark against other companies. And then, of course, there are institutions that help us to maintain a common data infrastructure. Open data that is available for anyone to access, use and share, assets that are maintained collaboratively across a sector or domain. They can be things like registers, or they can be things like standards, as well as data itself. In all of these cases, we need strong organizations, institutions that help to steward this data, that provide a convening point for the organizations and people that are sharing data, those that want to reuse it, and also the people who are affected in communities who are affected by the use of data. What we've found in our research is that there are three kind of big challenges for data institutions. First, that they need to have a strong purpose, one that is narrow enough that they're able to provide a commonality between the different stakeholders whose needs and requirements they have to balance. The purpose needs to provide a justification, a motivation for sharing data, for stewarding it on behalf of that community. Second is that these institutions need to be trustworthy and trusted, so be able to communicate well about why they're trustworthy. They frequently need to be independent from the organizations that are sharing data, that are gathering data, and those that are reusing it. And they need to have that independence in part to prevent decisions being taken that are against their purpose. They need to also demonstrate practices that build trust with their communities, including those kinds of public participation exercises that I was talking about. And finally, and possibly most challengingly, these organizations, these data institutions, need to be sustainable. They need to have business models that provide for their longevity so that we can rely on them being there in the long term. And it is a challenge when project-based funding means that sustainability can be challenged for these kinds of organizations. In our work, then, we've been looking at three types of data institutions. There's a lot of fuss and noise and interest in the new forms of data institution, data trusts, data cooperatives, data unions. In the European Union, they're called data altruism organizations. These new forms of organization that enable people to share data with others. But we have to not forget existing data institutions, national statistics offices, biobanks, company registers, and so on, are all existing data institutions. They are often very robust. They have sorted out their sustainability. They're well trusted because they've been around for a while. But sometimes they have to, there are some needs to update their kinds of business models and their mechanisms for building trust, just because of the changing context and expectations of our current world. And finally, in ones that I think are really interesting, we see old institutions, existing institutions, needing to take on new data duties. So these can be regulators, they might be professional bodies, philanthropic or other grant funding organizations, consumer advocacy organizations, labor unions. These are all institutions that have communities that are trusted, that are sustainable, and that could steward data on behalf of their sectors or their communities, their membership. So we are particularly at ODI looking at how existing organizations can take on these new data duties to become data institutions, and take on data take on building data infrastructure as part of what they do. So in my final segment, I'll talk about the virtues of a Verdant vision. I think we hear a lot about how digital and data, the role of AI, and how this is an industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, and it is, right? Data is a new form of asset that is changing the way in which we do business, and the way in which our economies and societies work. But I also like to think of it as a reformation. The Reformation, like 500 years ago, was revolutionary because it put the Bible into the hands of the people. It meant that from translating the Bible into the natural language that people spoke, their native tongues, rather than just being in Latin, it meant that information was available to them to make judgments about, to form opinions around, to debate. And it wasn't an easy process, the Reformation, because those reinterpretations were challenging to the orthodoxy and were sometimes wildly off, right? This was a time of great change in the power structures between people and clergy, and between people and each other. And I think that we have a similar kind of challenge now. Data's availability to people who previously have not had direct access to data is changing the way in which they think and work with information, and changing their relationships with each other, and changing the relationships between them, the citizens, and the traditional authorities. And we have to recognize that this is as well as being an industrial revolution, a time of change in the kind of economic sphere, this is a time of change in the social sphere because of these changing power dynamics. So if we look at like what's happening, these revolutions and reformations, these are periods of extreme change. If you did a pestle analysis about what is happening in the world right now, all of these factors are changing because of the use of digital and data. And that means that that we are a little bit kind of at sea, right? That things change around us, and that we have to navigate this changing landscape fairly rapidly. And we could end up in difficult places. At ODI, we talk about two forms of dystopia that we think might happen. A data hoarding dystopia driven by an attitude that data is oil, that it is somehow precious in and of itself rather than in use, where the use of data is narrowly confined to particular organizations. The same organizations that collect data are those that interpret it, are those that use it, where only some decision makers get access to the information they need in order to make decisions, where only some are able to create analyses and tools and services over the top of data. So we get a restricted market of these intermediaries, a restricted set of people who can interpret it, and therefore only a restricted set of decision makers who can benefit from it. And an environment where there's more extraction of data from people and from organizations than there is a collaborative use of data. So that's one dystopia that we are worried about, where our push towards openness and your push towards openness is what helps to stave that off. Openness in the infrastructure that we build, in the capability that we build to use data, and in driving innovation towards the goals that really matter, like the Sustainable Development Goals, is what helps us to steer away from that dystopia. The other dystopia we're worried about at ODI is one where we get so worried about the use of data and its impacts and harms, which are very real, and it's right to be thinking of them, but the way we get so worried about those that we're no longer able to collect data, to use it, that individuals or communities or even whole societies start to withdraw consent for the use of data for particular purposes, where people or organizations get into the habit of providing misleading data because they're worried about how it might be misused, and therefore that we get into a state of drawing poor conclusions because the quality of our data is simply poor, because we're missing people who are too afraid to contribute information, where people lie and therefore and therefore we get poor quality data. And the way in which we counteract that dystopia, the way we lean against it, is by building trust. This is why aspects of ethics, of engagement and participation around the use of data, and of thinking about the equity around data use, so who gets to benefit from the use of data, is so important, because it's only through building those practices that we build trust that helps to stave off this dystopia. So this is our, at ODI, our kind of theory of change model, that we need to push towards a positive impact from data, that verdant vision, our farmland future as we call it. And that we do this by pushing on both openness and trust and trustworthiness around the use of data. But we have to recognize that in this massively changing landscape, we can't predict all the consequences of our interventions, of the new technologies that we create, of the new policies that we put into place. We have to be constantly monitoring and seeing how those interventions actually impact in the real world, and nudging back towards this middle, towards this positive impact. And none of this is possible for any of us to do alone. We're all in this on this journey of trying to make data work for everyone. And that's why I think that your work here within the Research Data Alliance is incredibly important. You have this strong vision around openly sharing and reusing data across technologies, disciplines and countries, and towards these grand challenges that we face as society. That's the vision that will ensure that we're navigating towards that vision, is what will ensure we end up in a good place, that verdant vision, that farmland future, rather than those two dystopias that I described. So I just wanted to say thank you for all of your work around within the Research Data Alliance, in particular because so much of it is voluntary. And please do see yourselves as working just a little bit towards that verdant vision and away from the dystopias that we could end up with. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Jenny. You've given us so much, I think, to think about there, and done such a good job, I think, of portraying those links between the public spaces, the private spaces. Yeah, I'm not even going to attempt to summarize it. Not surprisingly, it's generated, I think, a lot of reaction in the chat, a lot of questions. And I know you said you weren't able to pick up on those while you were speaking. So I hope now I'm picking out the ones that are getting most reaction. And one of them particularly, you mentioned early on that reusing research data outside of a research context is often problematic. And certainly I think much of the audience agrees, sympathize with that. And somebody's asking, how can we change expectations to reduce that sense of it being problematic? And if we taking the assumption that things funded publicly through research are a public good and therefore we want.
So I think that part of it is about changing the way in which we kind of build that research data infrastructure. So setting up institutions that support bringing together data that is then used by multiple parties, including researchers. That we think of that not just as kind of data being brought together for one particular project, but long-term institutional commitments for data being made available as part of a research, as part of a data infrastructure for everybody, for every sector. Now, there are already some really, really good examples of this. I'm not saying it's not happening at all. What I'm saying is that it's that we need to move further towards having those institutional investments. Because it's that long-term kind of commitment that is what makes a reliable data infrastructure. Does that answer the question?
Well, whether I'll leave it up to the questions. It certainly seems to me to go some way to addressing that. And I think also much of what you said, I think after that question was originally asked around these different models of data governance, also perhaps go a long way to doing that. So again, I'd like to go back to something you touched on early on in your talk about the use of data to support decision making. I mean, clearly we've seen lots of examples of that with the pandemic, but obviously it's a much wider thing in terms of policy and indeed in research. And I wonder if you've got any observations on what I think sometimes perceived as a tension between getting data quickly to support rapid decision making and accepting that data perhaps has many shortcomings, as you indicated, and perhaps putting more curatorial stewardship processes in the way to ensure that data is more accurate and complete, and as a result not being able to take the decisions you want to when you want to. Do we have any good models for trying to balance those?
So I think it's obviously a just really tricky area, but I think that the approach that I would like to see us taking is one where information is available with a load of caveats around it as quickly as possible, so that those decisions can be made more rapidly, but that there is frequent revisiting of that information as things change over time and as more perspectives and more information becomes available. So for me, the part of it that that makes it work is that iteration. It's revisiting. It's not taking information now because we need it now, making a decision that we then stick with forever. It's about making sure that we have flexibility to change our minds as the information that we have is changing. Because I don't think that the alternative of just like operating in the dark with no information to help us make those decisions is until information is really tightly curated is the right way to go. I think that we have to get better at decision makers recognize, and us as the kind of recipients of those decisions, recognizing that they are operating in an environment where there is limited information always, right? You can never have a perfect understanding of everything that is going on, and therefore that things can happen to change minds, and that should happen to that iteration should happen in order to get us to a better place.
Great, thanks, Jenny. And flipping a bit, another question here that's got a good number of votes. You mentioned at one point that ethics boards, whilst being perhaps a necessary thing, are not sufficient, that we need some broader way of dealing with some of those issues around reuse. How can we convince those ethics boards that they aren't on their own enough, given that I think for many of them, they're an example of those long-standing institutions that believe this is the way we work, this is the way we always have worked, and we always will work. Do you have any good examples of how to broaden that?
Yeah, I mean, trying to change institutions is always a challenge, right? I think that one of the points I'd make around this is to highlight that expectations have changed out in the rest of the world, and that the forms and structures that we have are no longer sufficient to provide the kinds of reassurance that people need. If you can point to places where ethics boards have signed off particular studies, but that have then hit the press because it's a big fuss, right? Because and cause then reputational damage to researchers and to the institutions. Those are the kinds of examples that can help, I think, an ethics body to understand the broader context in which it is operating. And it's not that I think that ethics bodies are rubbish. A good, well-functioning ethics body is one, I think, that specifically goes out of its way to understand the opinions and norms of those that its decisions are affecting, and that's an additional kind of burden for them. But it means that there is less risk actually associated with them making poor decisions that later come back to bite them and researchers and the institution later on. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And another point around the issue around data privacy, and particularly thinking about this from an individual perspective. Somebody's raised an idea that I think has come up in a number of contexts of being a concept that individuals have a sense of ownership around data that pertains to them, and this being a means by which we can begin to think about privacy differently. Do you have any, I think the question was asked, do you have any thoughts on that? Is this an approach that has benefit?
So I have very strong opinions about that concept. I think I think it comes out of a notion that that individuals, by having ownership, will have more control over the decisions that are made about the data that is produced by them. And I think it has two or maybe three kind of fundamental flaws around it. First, the notion that, from just a practical point of view, the notion that people will take that amount of interest in the use of their data that is about them, I think is from the studies that I've seen, is fundamentally flawed. There are a few who will take that level of interest and want to have that level of control, but the vast majority of people aren't sufficiently exercised by that they're going to take those extra steps. The second is that, and perhaps more fundamental, well, the second is that data that is about any one individual is often about other people as well. And that can apply in a very direct way because it's data about me, that's also about my household or about my family, or it can apply in a much looser way in the data that is about me as a middle-aged white woman is also going to be data about other middle-aged white women, because we have enough in common that my habits and circumstances are going to give implications about yours. So that means that personal ownership doesn't really work, because the data that's about me can affect others. And then the third point is that the ethical use of data affects more than the donors of that data, affects more than the people that are providing data. And so I think that there's personally a fundamental flaw when we only look at the rights of the data, rights of those that data is about, as opposed to the rights of those that data affects. And so for me, then the ownership kind of approach fails practically. It fails from a kind of because data is not about individuals. Actually, it's about lots of people, and it fails because it has this focus on data that is about the people providing the rights of people providing data, rather than those that it affects. That isn't to say that individuals shouldn't be given control. I think that they absolutely should. But we have to recognize the limits of that as an approach to getting to the good, ethical, equitable outcomes that we really want to aim for.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, very nuanced, I think, things to think about there. So I'm going to, in a sense, take the liberties a share and combine, I think, a couple of questions that have come up that relate to issues of costs. And how we connect those to sustainability. So one questioner, for instance, has pointed out that it's not unusual to have long pipelines in data where the ultimate beneficiaries are not very well connected to those who will incur costs in keeping data and making data available. And indeed, personally, some years ago, we were under contract to do work for the UK National Archives. One of the things we were working on was the 1961 census, thinking that you're working on data that nobody was legally allowed to look at for 100 years, but you knew that in 100 years, there would be huge benefit. And it really only governments who can think, you'd hope, can think in that long term to make that investment to eventually realize that gain. And many of us, I think, can work in areas where there are similar, perhaps not 100-year pipelines, but even 20-year pipelines. And it's very difficult to connect benefits to payments, and the people involved are different. Do you have any examples, I think, from, I mean, you mentioned various sorts of data institutions there. Are these ways to address those issues, do you think?
Yeah, so I think that's the that's the kind of conclusion that we've come to. One of the reasons that we talk about data as being infrastructure is that this is one of the qualities of infrastructure, right? That it requires some upfront investment, and the payoff from it is one that we only realize over the very long term. Traditionally, in these kinds of, there are various ways of kind of supporting that kind of infrastructural investment. Some of it is through public investment. Some of it is through public-private kind of arrangements. Sometimes philanthropic organizations get involved in order to build that kind of infrastructure. But this is what we need to do, right? Data is a new form of infrastructure, and therefore we should be investing in it in the same way as we invest in infrastructure. I think that it then becomes interesting to look at what are the sustainability models that you can put around, or what are the funding and business models that you can put around building that infrastructure and stewarding and maintaining it. And that's, again, part of the real research that we've been doing at ODI about what those sustainability models look like, in particular when the institutions that need to steward that data infrastructure have to be driven by a purpose that involves sharing as openly as possible and therefore as freely as possible, which obviously has real challenges from a getting some money back into the organization point of view. So that work has highlighted different kinds of models, not only the kind of investment from philanthropic, from public sources, but also things like membership models or added value services that enable you to provide free access to basic data and added value paid for services for, say, APIs or insights over the top of that data. So I think we need to be experimenting with different kinds of revenue models that help the sustainability of those organizations. But fundamentally, we need to be thinking of this in terms of infrastructure investment for the long term, rather than in terms of just putting something up and then tearing it down again.
Absolutely, and I think that that's certainly struck a chord with a lot of this audience. Not surprisingly, even though I think there are times when people, I think, are concerned with whether, you know, we're broadening this use of the term infrastructure, whether we lose the meaning there. But you're absolutely right, that intangible infrastructure as opposed to physical infrastructure is an important way of thinking about it. So again, try to pick up another question here, and I acknowledge a number of people made the point is the problem is behaving strangely with things leaping up and down. It's getting difficult to track them. But well, one question I did spot earlier was I think in relation to the comments you made about data literacy and the need to improve that more generally to avoid some of the issues we've seen. And someone has asked what role, if any, you see citizen science having in promoting that. Is that a way to broaden either that literacy or indeed the sense of ownership about data and discovery and everything else?
Yeah, I think that's a really lovely point. So my basic my fundamental understanding around data literacy is that in just the same way as we talk about like English language and or our native tongue, that where we need to be able to produce it, to write essays and poems and so forth. And we also need to be able to critique existing literature, existing kind of poetry, and be able to understand it in context. That we have that twin kind of approach when it comes to natural language, that we need that same twin kind of approach when it comes to data. So we need skills in people to manipulate data, to collect it, to understand it, but we also need skills to critique data collection, to critique how it is being used, to think critically about the role of data in our society even. And it's by data literacy for me is bringing both of those together, right? Both of those parts of the equation. Personally, I think that it needs to start in school. It needs to start as part of our history curriculum, looking at the role of the census. It needs not just in terms of our kind of maths curriculum, in terms of the data language, if you like. But I do think that there are, for me, some of the most inspirational kinds of initiatives are those where communities collaborate together to create data that they then use in order to empower themselves, in order to inform themselves, in order to make arguments to decision makers as well. So whether that's like citizen science collecting data within their local environment about air pollution and then going to their councillors in order to demonstrate, you know, the issues that they see, or whether it's workers collecting data and information about their working environment that they can then use in order to make arguments to their bosses. Empowerment with data does involve collaborating with data, and the more platforms that we have that help to support that collaboration in ways that don't require you to be like, you know, hardcore data scientists, it is, I think, a valuable way of seeing data as an empowerment tool rather than just something that is used to inform you and do things to you.
Okay, thanks very much. And another question again, changing, I think, domains, spheres of think about entirely, and it relates to open data and lower middle income countries in particular. And I think this is equally relevant in the context of research and researchers in lower middle income countries and public data as well. And I suspect one of our panels later this week, we're going to have a speaker from the World Bank who'll be touching on that as well. But do you think any of these messages need to change to take into account, I think, some of the valid concerns expressed by people in lower middle income countries that we risk essentially repeating some of the dangers of colonialism there, with taking from countries and not giving back if we've got expectations of everyone being equally open.
Yeah, I think that I've been in environments where I've seen organizations and people talk very enthusiastically about gathering data about a particular, say, city or nation, bringing it back to their headquarters, processing it, making some decisions about how they're going to fund or invest, therefore, in that city or nation. And that pattern, to me, of taking data about a particular community and people and then using it to make decisions that then affect them without involving them in those decisions and without empowering them with that same data, I think is a pattern of exploitation, data exploitation, and one that we need to avoid. Now, that doesn't mean that no organization can use data from a particular city or nation unless it's within that city or nation or community. But it does mean that those people who are the data is about need to have first dibs and need to have visibility over what that information is, and have some control over what gets collected in the first place. And this is part of my point around participation. We need to up our levels of thinking around participation and the role of people and communities about whom data is collected in shaping even the research questions that we ask, the data collection that we have, and the use of that data and who gets to see it. So for me, getting a proper empowerment at that kind of community and city and nation kind of level is absolutely essential to avoid that exploitation that we'd otherwise see. Great.
Thanks very much, Jenny. We're coming close to the end of our time now. I'm going to just take one more question from the list. There are more, but I'm sure we'd be happy to engage with people in other ways afterwards. And I suspect a relatively straightforward question to answer, to finish with. You listed in one of your slides, I think, a number of different types of organizations who play different roles in dealing with data. You were talking about, I can't remember the exact phrase, but I think, the old institutions and newer institutions. And a few people observed in the chat that there were some examples missing. People have mentioned universities and libraries as being ones that you didn't. But perhaps to reassure people, would you confirm or perhaps disagree with the idea that they could be amongst those data institutions?
Absolutely, absolutely. I didn't list every single kind of institution that there could possibly be. So not only, I think libraries play a very interesting role, in particular local libraries around, or potential role, in particular local libraries around data for their local communities. I think that is extremely interesting and exciting. I think that universities can play an institutional role, but we have to also bear a data institutional role, but we also have to bear in mind those points that I made around independence of those data institutions. So it is important for data institutions to be independent from either the providers of data and the potential reusers of that data. And if a university was using its institutional role as a data steward in order to, and then favoured its own academics, say, for access to that data, then that, I think, would be more problematic, if that makes sense. So for me, then the data institutions, particularly around research data, probably sit outside universities, or they are made up of collaborations between multiple universities in order to provide that kind of independence.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks very much. Well, we have come to the end of our time now. Thank you again, Jenny. I'm sure you'll be hearing a huge amount of applause. I've seen the reaction. Unfortunately, in this environment, you're just going to make do with a few emojis on the screen. Thanks again. I'm sure we'll be touching on lots of these questions later on in the week. Thanks to all the rest of our hosts. A reminder that now, if you want to learn a little bit more about how to speak the way folks speak up here, which is Scots, is available in the next breakout session. Goodbye all. Thank you.